Let's jump in. So we're excited to be here with you. As some of you may have joined us before the elections for sort of our predictions, our look ahead. So this is the bookend to that now that the elections are done. And I believe every race has been called at this point. Obviously, some of the big races we've known for a while. So I'm joined by my colleagues, Tom Luna and Tara Reed Cherry. I will have you two just do quick intros of yourselves. For those of you who know me, I'm a partner at Strategos Group. I lead market intelligence and strategy. Spent a number of years on Capitol Hill and at the U.S. Department of Education. I'm a former teacher and formerly in the private sector, and I've been with Strategos for the last 5 years. And I'm excited to be here with you. We've been doing these, Tom, particularly you and I, for the last couple of election cycles. So it's fun to dig in to this with you. So, Tom, do you want to do a quick intro of yourself and then
Sure.
Tara, and then we will jump in?
Yeah, and folks, thanks for joining us. Tom Luna, I've been a partner at Strategos for 6, 7 years, I guess. And prior to that, I had the honor of being the state superintendent of education for the great state of Idaho for 8 years. Worked with Doug and another colleague of ours, Todd, and at the Department of Ed for 2 years in the Bush administration. Got to know some great people there. When I was superintendent of education in Idaho, I served as president of the CCSSO and also served a term as a member of the National Assessment Governing Board, or NAGB, and learned a lot there about assessments and the work that NAGB does and the NAEP test and stuff. So I just thankful for people to be a part of this. I did serve for a period of time as the chairman of the Idaho Republican Party, so I guess that brings a little bit of political perspective, and we're going to be covering some of that today. So hopefully you'll find this all helpful.
Great.
Tara Reed Cherry, partner at Strategos Group. I'm based in Tallahassee, Florida, and I lead our government affairs practice. So obviously a lot of eyes on Florida right now and kind of what's happening with our elections. I had the honor of serving on two governor's races in both 2014 and 2018. So excited to be a part of the conversation, and thanks everyone for joining.
Fantastic. Thanks, Tom and Tara. Let's jump in. We're going to start at the federal level. I'm sure folks have heard a lot, wondering about a lot, and we'll do our best to sort of give you our view of what the election means at the federal level and at the state level, both for governors, for state chiefs, for state boards of education, for ballot measures. And then we'll do a little prognosticating with what the issues will be that we'll see moving forward now that some of the dust is settling on the election. So at the federal level, obviously we know the outcome of the election, and I think we also have a pretty good idea of the key elements that a Trump administration and President-elect Trump are likely to focus on. I'll start off by saying I don't think education is going to be a top priority, at least for the next year or so. There are a lot of other issues like immigration, tariffs, the economy, foreign policy. I think education will make an appearance, but I also don't know that they're going to spend a ton of time in political capital right out of the gate, with a couple of exceptions. And I'll talk about those in a minute. But to the extent that education policy does have a focus, school choice is first and foremost, I think, the policy that they're going to aggressively pursue. And we'll talk a minute about what that might look like. They're going to reverse the Biden policies on higher ed to the extent that they can. They'll stop loan forgiveness. They'll stop some of the regulatory actions that the Biden administration had started or was working on finalizing. Clearly cultural issues. So you can expect to see a lot of activity really early on. So, for example, you can expect the Trump administration to reverse the Title IX regulation that was finalized not that long ago, which is in some form of legal limbo in a number of states. But you can bet that they'll start the process to reverse that. And then I think you'll also see some efforts to address, quote unquote, wokeness. Now, there's not a lot that they can do on that front because by law, by statute in ESSA, the secretary and the U.S. Department of Ed are prohibited from weighing in on local curriculum issues and the content. However, there are discretionary grants, and you can expect to see the Trump administration to release a new set of priorities, a really different set of priorities. So, not changing who can apply, but the things that they'll look for the applications that they receive, very much, anti DEI and CRT and again wokeness and much more of a different sort of framing of that. And then lastly, I think there will be efforts to cut appropriations across the board, but within education as well. Now, how successful they'll be on that is a whole different question. I will just flag two areas that I think will also get a lot of attention and frankly are very bipartisan. One is career and technical education, workforce pathways, getting folks ready for the workforce, particularly high school students, and then early childhood education, in particular, increasing support for childcare. Could be the Child Care Development Block Grant. It could be, frankly, something new on this front. There's been some proposals in past sessions of Congress to provide more funding, even a new program. I don't think you'll see a universal pre-K program coming from the feds, but there is a lot of bipartisan support for early childhood education. Now, a couple of things that I don't think will happen. Project 2025, you've heard a lot about. When I say it will not happen, I mean from an education standpoint. And part of that is there's been a lot of talk about eliminating the U.S. Department of Education. Just keep in mind, it takes an act of Congress to eliminate an agency, a department. It was created by statute, and so they would have to pass legislation to do that. But they would also have to pass legislation to figure out what to do with all the component parts. Like just getting rid of the Department of Ed, you still have higher ed out there. You still have all of the formula grants, title grants. So that it's not just passing one bill. It would be a massive reorganization. And as I'll talk about in a minute, the Republicans don't have a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate. So you would need, I would guess, at least 60 votes to do anything sort of that significant. And I doubt that some of the Democratic members in the Senate would go along with those proposals, whether they're in Project 2025 or eliminating the Department of Ed. So there are some limitations, and I think some of those are going to prove to be barriers to some of the more, if I could say, radical proposals that may have been floated, particularly during the campaign. I'm going to cover. Yes.
Doug, quick question. I believe you've said too, even moving, because there's been a lot of question, okay, if you can't eliminate the US DOE, could you, transition some of the power to another agency or something like that? And you've mentioned that also takes an act of Congress, right? You can't move pieces of the department to other agencies in order to kind of piecemeal it together.
Exactly, Tara. And Tom, I'll see if you have any questions or thoughts on this. So most of the offices within the U.S. Department of Education, so the Office of Civil Rights and, the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education, the Office of Special Education, they are in statute. So you would have to pass legislation if you were going to try to move a whole office to a different agency. And likewise, you hear a lot of conversation about shifting the federal workforce. Just keep in mind, I worked in that building for 4 years. The career civil servants who are there during any administration, they are protected both by the very nature of their jobs in terms of the agreements that they've signed to work, but they also are represented by a union. And I can tell you some of the most challenging conversations, Tom, you may recall this, when we were inside the department looking to change how things worked, were trying to negotiate with the federal union who represent civil servants because they're protecting jobs and they're protecting job responsibilities and pay. So there's a lot of proposals and there will be a lot of conversation, but when it comes down to actually making these kinds of changes, it's a lot harder than it may otherwise appear, or the rhetoric that you hear may appear. Tom, do you have any thoughts or questions or on this that we can jump into?
Yeah, Doug, for the conversation about block grants isn't new. It's been going on for years and through multiple administrations. If the department were to use the current funding formulas that are in place, but distribute the funds more with through block grants and not through and remove a lot of the guidance and regulation around those. Talk about the pathway towards a block grant type of an approach with most of the funds that the U.S. Department sends to states.
Yeah, I mean, Tom, a couple of thoughts. It's a great question. A couple of thoughts on that. First of all, you can't block grant current federal formula programs, with the one exception of Title IV. Title IV Part A is effectively a form of a block grant, but it's small. It's $1 billion or so. But Title I, Title II, Title III, special ed, you'd have to rewrite the statute to do that. They can't just unilaterally sign a piece of paper and make it happen. And again, when I look at the Senate, I just don't see there's enough votes to say fundamentally rewrite Title I into a block grant.
So filibuster becomes an issue there also.
100%. Absolutely, it does. And by the way, right, to get appropriations bills done, they're going to have to be bipartisan at some level because in the Senate, again, there's filibusters and you're going to have some level of cooperation to get that done. So again, that puts some constraints on what can be done. And then last thing I'll say, Tom, we just had the nation's biggest experiment with federal education block grants. It was called stimulus funding. And I got to tell you, there's a lot of mixed views about how those dollars were used. Were they effective? What were they used for? So when you look at all three of the ESSER tranches, those were effectively block grants. And I'm not sure anybody feels particularly comfortable with how all those dollars were used, the accountability for those dollars. So I don't know that block grants have quite the same luster as they did pre-stimulus dollars. So that's something to keep in mind. All right, I want to keep us moving. We have a Secretary of Education nominee, Linda McMahon, who has I will say charitably, a thin resume on education. She was a member of the Connecticut State Board of Education for just over a year. She left that to run for, I can't remember if it was governor or senator. I should know that. For Senate, which she did win. She was the sort of co-chair of the Trump campaign and the America First Policy Institute. So you can see some of those, sort of policies that the campaign and that particular Trump-aligned think tank put forward. She has been supportive of school choice and sort of her statements. I think she'll be very supportive of CTE and workforce. But I also think and I should say she's the former director of the Small Business Administration in the first Trump administration. She did run the WWE back in the day. So I think she has real management skills, right? So from that perspective, I think she will have more experience in sort of trying to get things done. But what her true sort of policy proposals will be, I think it's a little bit up in the air. And I also think it'll depend on who they appoint. So as deputy secretary, as undersecretary, and the various assistant secretaries. And none of that's happened yet. So outside of, I think, the things that we already know, I don't know that we know a lot more at this point until she gets in front of the Senate and goes through the nomination process. I talked about some of the other policy areas here. The one thing I will note, though, this last point, they say in DC personnel is policy, and getting personnel in place will take some time, even with a Republican controlled Senate, finding the people, getting them through the process. So I see more status quoism, except for the Title IX piece out of the gate. I think that will be one of the very first things they do at the U.S. Department of Ed. They just don't have enough political appointees to sort of um, drive an agenda, at least for 6 to 9 months, is what I think. Tom, any last things before we move on to sort of the control of Congress?
Nope, I think that's it. I think you summed it up well.
All right, so let's talk about this real
Hey,
quick.
hey
Yes,
Doug,
Tara.
there's a question, and I think it was answered, and just around moving DOE's duties, like Doug said, that also takes an act of Congress.
Correct.
So it's just remains challenging with the Senate filibuster.
Yeah, and it's fun to write stories about, how crazy, terrible, awful things will be. The reality is, and this is, one of the virtues of our system, federalism, the division of separation of powers. What's possible to do sort of unilaterally is limited, frankly, and it will require a lot of legislative cooperation to do major, significant, shall I even say, radical transformations of the department, of its functions, of its funding. And I point to the slide that you're looking at here, where even with Republican control of the Senate, it's not filibuster proof. So to pass anything that would be a significant departure from the status quo, you would need to get at least 7 Democrats to come over to your side. And now that might be possible. Like anything is possible, right? But I think it's unlikely. Now let's talk about practical effects. So the Senate flipped from Democrat to Republican control. Senator Cassidy is now going to be the chair of the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, Republican from Louisiana. He was the ranking member on the committee while the Democrats were in control. He is very steeped in education. He has a strong staff, very focused on the science of reading. His wife has a strong education background, and I accidentally went forward. Let me go back. And I would expect to see a lot of activity coming from the Senate Health Committee. And interestingly enough, he and Senator Sanders worked on a bipartisan basis on a number of issues, whether it was the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, WIOA, or the Education Sciences Reform Act. There were a number of areas where they were working in a bipartisan fashion. And I believe Senator Sanders would like to remain on Senate Help as ranking member. And Sanders has a very strong staff as well. So I would see much more of the same. But of course, Cassidy will have some things he'll want to emphasize, like choice and charters. But I would expect to see a very active Senate Help Committee. And then in terms of funding, again, you're going to have a change in control of the Appropriations Committee. But there's another old saying in DC. There's actually 3 parties. There's Republicans, Democrats, and appropriators. Appropriators tend to work in a little bit different way, very bipartisan way, and particularly in the Senate, this is true. So again, I would expect more status quo, not necessarily huge increases or huge decreases, but more of just kind of where we're at, kind of a flat funding situation. And then the House, it's an even narrower majority than we had in the last Congress. So Republicans retain control, much to everyone's surprise. But Trump has picked a number of Republicans to serve in his administration from the House and, frankly, from the Senate, making these majorities even narrower. Again, it's hard to get much done when you've got a 2 or 3 or 4 seat majority. But the Republicans do have a majority. Virginia Fox, who was the former chairwoman of the House Education and Workforce Committee, so she's term limited as chair of that committee. She'll still be in Congress, and she may wind up being a chair of a different committee. So there will be a new leader of the House Education Committee. Right now, the 2 leading candidates are Representative Owens from Utah and Representative Wahlberg from Michigan. We shall see. Some of that will shake out here in the next month. And then a very similar legislative agenda. And the House will be more active in trying to cut funding and trying to make big moves on sort of funding and policy. And Tom, I think you're trying to jump in. I want to make one last quick point. School choice. The most likely vehicle that I think Congress Republicans will try to move on school choice is they're going to use a budget vehicle called reconciliation, and they will try to add into the tax code some sort of tax advantage scholarship approach. And that will be sort of the big school choice push. I don't see them changing Title I into a school choice program or elsewhere. I think it'll be a tax code thing that they'll move through reconciliation, and that will happen in the next 6 to 9 months of next year when the new Congress comes into session. All right, thoughts, questions, Tom, Tara?
I think it's going to be very interesting with the new chairs of both education committees, and especially, I don't want to repeat a lot about what you said, but Senator Cassidy's always been very involved and passionate about education, and so he comes in with a lot of experience and a lot of ideas and things he wants done. So I think that if anything's going to happen in education, it's probably not going to happen in the department with some of the big changes that have been floated, but it'll happen through the legislature under the leadership of these two new chairs.
Completely agree, Tom. There will be a lot of rhetoric. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But two last quick points. ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, not going to be reauthorized anytime soon, but I do think you will start to see some more conversation about what a reauthorization could look like. They may even hold a hearing or two. So be on the lookout for that. And then Representative Bobby Scott, he's a Democrat from Virginia, been on the Education Committee for a long, long time. He will be the ranking member on House Education. And he will also has a very strong point of view and also works in a bipartisan fashion when it can be done. So we shall see. It will be very fascinating. And that sort of drives the conversation of a lot of change at the federal level, but a lot of constraints in terms of what can actually sort of be done. But that takes us to the state level, where there's a lot of change at the federal level, and frankly, less at the state level than you might otherwise believe. So I'm going to spend a minute, and then Tom and Tara, please jump in. There were 11 races. No change in political control. So if it was a state that had a governor who was a Republican, they have a Republican again. And if they were Democratic, they're Democratic again. You have 3 states where the incumbent ran and won. So Montana, Utah, and Vermont. The other 8 had new governors because they were term limited, but they're of the same party. So that's some level of continuity. And then obviously the governors have a big impact on policy, on funding, and Tom, who winds up sitting in the chief state school officer seat as well as the state boards of education. So Tom, why don't you jump in here too? And Tara, if you have thoughts.
Yeah, I think when you look at these governors' races, one thing that's interesting is the 6 new governors. They're from the same party, but looking at the things that they campaigned on, every one of them had an education as points in what they ran on, a number of them focusing on school choice. So you can expect them to work to implement those things that they ran on in their campaign. And the other thing is, when you look at the state chiefs that are there, the state chiefs are appointed by state boards or other means, but the governor will have some influence. We would assume that since the governors that were elected that are new aren't from a different party, that the likelihood of them making a change at the state chief level is probably not as great compared to if the new governor was coming from a different party than the previous governor. Then you could anticipate a possible change in the state chief. So something to pay attention to there.
I'll hold my
Tara,
thoughts, Doug,
okay.
until next. And then I see more questions. I think we'll hold those till the end so everyone knows we're not ignoring you.
Good plan. That sounds good. So, Tom and Tara, talk about trifectas. No, we're not talking about horse racing. So, what did we see here at the state sort of legislative level, and how that plays in with the governors that we just talked about?
Yeah, let me jump in here real quick. So just so you understand, that trifecta is when one party has the governor seat, they control a majority of the seats in the House and in the Senate at the state level. And you would expect that when one party has a trifecta, that that their agenda is going to be the main focus and will be a successful agenda. That isn't always the case, because you can end up with infighting within a party that can mean that some things, some possibilities and options that they have just don't get done. But you can see here that across the country, there's 23 states where the Republicans have the governorship. They have a majority of the House and the Senate. The Democrats, there's 15, and there's 12 states that is divided. In other words, one party holds at least one or two of these areas of power, but they don't own all three. The only change that we saw here was the Republicans had trifectas in 23 states before the election. That remained the same. The Democrats had control of 17. That went down by 2. I believe, Doug, it was Minnesota and
Michigan.
that flipped. One of their bodies went Republican. And so we went from 10 divided states to 12 divided states. So when you're looking at working policy, if you're looking at taking a legislative play and looking at policy or a piece of legislation that could that you're going to pursue in your business, knowing how this landscape looks can be helpful as you navigate the best path forward.
Yeah, Tom, I think to your point, the assumption is always that the agendas are aligned. And I think while that is often true, and I think policy can move very quickly, and state trifectas can be a little more aggressive with what they're pushing, I find that in government affairs, it sometimes makes it more challenging to get ideas across, because oftentimes, they're all aligned. And so coming in with a great idea or a great solution, they might already have something in mind. And so I think having relationships in all, within those trifectas is really important. Obviously, bipartisan relationships is always critical. And then I also think, we've talked a little bit about this, but the nuance, even with the trifecta of something somewhere like Oklahoma, right, where that trifecta is working against the state superintendent and what he wants to do. And then I think Texas is also interesting to me, just from a school choice perspective, because as a red state, it's been less friendly to school choice than some of the other red states. So it's not always a consistent agenda throughout the US. It's not, they're not voting in a monolith.
Yeah, I mean, context matters, right? Even things like Virginia, where I live, they're going to have a governor's election along with New Jersey. They're off year elections. Who knows why? But so, for all practical purposes, those governors have the next legislative session to try to get what they can get done, but they're largely lame duck at this point. And then you've got a whole bunch of governors, right, in 26 who will be up for election. And so some of those are term limited, some of them are not. And that plays into, frankly, how much attention you have to pay to a governor's agenda, right? Where are they at politically, and what can they do in that regard? So the context is super important, and we will see, I expect, more change in 26, partly just because there's more governorships up for election in 2026. All right,
I
let's
also
keep
think
rolling.
too, Doug,
Yeah.
to my point about being aggressive, it's like within these trifectas, are the Senate or the House trying to out Republican or out Democrat each other? And so I
Yeah.
think, to your point, like in a state like Florida or a state like Texas, like, yeah, all the Republicans are, basically liked. So, no one's kind of pitting the other. It's hard to pit the other entities from each, to at each other. So it's just kind of interesting the way that that works out to me.
100%. Well, Tom, as a former elected state, were you secretary or commissioner in Idaho? I can't remember.
Superintendent.
Superintendent. So we had 4 elections. And Tom, I'd love for you to spend a minute here talking about both what stayed the same and then the new folks.
Yeah, so you see, for those of you who this isn't new as far as the current state chiefs, you see that that Chris was reelected in Washington, and Kristen Baszler was reelected in North Dakota, and won reelection pretty easily. But in Montana and North Carolina, we have a new state chief that was elected. Susie Hedlund from Montana replaced Elsie. Elsie was term limited, but also ran for Congress. And then Mo Green is the new state chief in North Carolina. That does flip from a Democrat or from Republican to Democrat, that state seat in North Carolina. Johnny Key and I have already had communications with the new state chiefs in Montana, North Carolina. They're eager to learn what's going on out there, and we're familiar with their agendas and the things they hope to accomplish. And so I think both states are going to be well served, but not a whole lot of change in the elected when it comes to Washington and North Dakota, but in Montana and North Carolina, they have new chiefs.
And Tom, that's super helpful. You mentioned Republican control in North Carolina under Truitt, now under Mo Green, a Democrat. Montana stayed Republican, right? Elsie Arnson was the previous elected state chief. Do we know much, Tom, about Mo Green and Susie Hedlund at this point? Like, where did they come from? What might we expect to see from them as new chief state school officers?
Yeah, we have, we know their backgrounds. They have education background. Mo was most recently worked at a local school district, and it comes with a background. He's 7 years as a superintendent of the, I think it's called Guilford County Schools, which is, I think, the third largest school district.
Guilford. It's Guilford.
There you go, Guilford. 70,000 students, and so he's also served as the executive director of the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation, and it supports various causes in public education. So he has quite a background in education, from the administrative side, from the classroom side, and also from a philanthropic background in helping education. Susie Hedlund, she was a superintendent of the Townsend School District and the vice chair of the Montana Board of Education. So she comes from a very strong background. She served as the deputy superintendent in the Montana Department of Ed, and has real extensive experience and background in K-20 education. So both of them come with a strong education background, and they're going to hit the ground running with their ideas and their focus.
Tara, were you going to jump in?
Nope, I'm good.
So I'll just say this one last piece and then we'll move on. It's, to me, you look at North Carolina, Democrat governor, Mo Green elected on the Democrat ticket, but pretty significant Republican majorities in the House and the Senate in North Carolina. I think Republicans may have lost a supermajority in North Carolina, but still hold the majority. Obviously, in Montana, it's Republican up and down the ticket. So it's just interesting to take note of that. And then obviously, Kirsten and Chris, some of the longer serving state chiefs. And so, I would expect more continuity than change there. So just interesting to note. We'll see more state chiefs up for election, just like we'll see more governors up for election in 26. So more rare than typical. Most state chiefs are appointed. And again, even with governors of the same party, and state chiefs appointed by the prior governor, maybe a new governor of the same party, but they may also be thinking about bringing in folks from their team that they know well. So it's worth keeping an eye on the states where there wasn't a change in party control, but a new governor, and what effect could that have on who is sitting in the corner office making the decisions as the chief state school officer.
And Doug, one more quick point.
Yeah.
There's 11 states that elect their state superintendent, right? So the others are appointed either by the governor or state boards or some combination of that. And that trend is actually going more and more towards the appointed. Indiana, just a few years ago, went from an elected state superintendent to appointed. Oregon did it a couple years before that. And so you may see that trend continue, but currently 11 of them are elected. 9 of them are partisan races. The other 2 are considered nonpartisan, but they pretty much end up being partisan just by the positions the different candidates take. But that's the current makeup of the elected state superintendents.
Perfect. And then, Tom, just to touch on this, we won't spend a lot of time, but people often forget the role of state boards of education. You can see the map, the states that had elections for state boards of education. The net here is essentially status quo. Alabama has a Republican majority. They still have it, even though there's some new members. Colorado has a Democratic majority, and they still have that, even though there's some new members. So you didn't see a lot of change in control, but you do see new members coming on, old members rolling off. And it's just notable that even for state boards of election or state boards of education, they have elections, and sometimes those can become really important. But again, nobody runs on like, hey, whatever the last guy did is good by me, right? When there's new people elected, there's new things happening because there's new ideas and new energy. That's why they're running for office. And so these are states that are worth keeping an eye on because there is, new membership, new members on these state boards. And in some cases, the state boards appoint the state chief. And so some of this is a stair step effect. So, Tom, I don't know if you have any thoughts on state boards of education.
No, I think you covered it well. These these elections can be costly and very, very partisan. And when you look at some of the issues that have been in front of state boards in the last couple of years that have, gotten a lot of attention, you can imagine how these races then become just that much more competitive and hotly contested.
Yep.
Texas being a great example. So
absolutely.
So, yeah.
Great. Let's keep rolling on the state level. We also had ballot measures. This one's a slightly easier to read. Again, you'll get these slides afterwards, so you can spend some more time with the tiny type on a couple of these slides. But there were, Tom, you had the numbers. There were more ballot measures than the ones
there was 18,
that are represented
here. Yeah, there was 12 states that had 18 ballot measures that were focused on education, and that's the most ever. The 18 was the most ever. So some of them were, didn't have much impact on education. It was like changing how school boards ran their elections or something across the state, but some of them
that one's on here, Tom. There's
Yeah.
8 represented here that we thought were more significant. A lot of the other ones were really, frankly, kind of hyper local in some regard. So we picked out these 8 as sort of being pretty important to keep an eye on. So from that perspective, Tara, why don't you take a minute, and I know you've done some looking into these, so I'd love for you to dig in on these and maybe start with Florida, because that's an interesting outcome.
And I think it's also sort of reflective of the slide before. This was more at the local level. So in 1998, Florida voters, through a constitutional amendment, basically decided that school board seats should be bipartisan. These, school board races, local school board races have become much more political Governor DeSantis has really, put his hand on the scales of some of these races. And so there was a bill to overturn that and make local school board races partisan. That failed. In Florida, you have to have 60% plus one for an amendment to pass. And so it's very challenging to pass an amendment in Florida, and that failed. Three that were interesting to me that I kind of grouped together were Colorado, Kentucky, and Nebraska, because those were all school choice related. And I think, to me, it's very interesting that all three essentially failed, and I'll explain the Nebraska piece. But in
Yeah.
Colorado, it was, language to say that every student has the right to school choice. That failed. In Kentucky, it would create the first private school choice program. That failed. And then in Nebraska, this was technically a referendum on a bill that passed that would allow grants to provide to students to go to private schools, and that was repealed. So it's very interesting to me that obviously we talk about school choice and how that will be very important to the president. But in these three states, they, in a way, rejected some of that ideal. So that's really interesting to me. I'm sure, obviously, like we've said, there's nuance in all of these states, and I'm not familiar with them, but that was fascinating. And then the other one that I think we've all been talking about is Massachusetts repealing the high school MCAS scores as a requirement to graduate. Assessments are changing. I heard Governor Bush talk about this in Oklahoma, specifically said that the teachers union was highly involved in passing this amendment. But yeah, I mean, that's sort of wild to me, as Massachusetts MCAS has obviously been an assessment that has been revered by many people as being a great one. And, they're getting rid of it. And then in Arkansas, they passed an amendment to allow VOTEC funds, the funds for VOTEC through their scholarship program. And then I'm less familiar with the Colorado and Utah amendments, but both of those did pass.
Yeah, and Tom, you may have some thoughts here too. So the kind of going in reverse order. So Utah and California and even Arkansas essentially voting to put more money into education. Different ways, context is different. I think the Arkansas one is interesting because in its expansion of those dollars being used for vocational technical education. But again, that emphasis on career readiness, on training students for actual jobs is a little bit of a shift in emphasis. And then to your point about Massachusetts, now the MCAS isn't going away, just its use as a requirement for graduation is, which is also interesting because New York State has announced that they're eliminating the Regents exam as a graduation requirement. And then you may all be familiar with what Oregon did last year, where they really reduced or even eliminated some of the requirements for students to graduate, some based on the assessment, some just other requirements. So definitely a change is afoot here, right? And even in Florida, right, with the change in the FCAT, moving from a single summative to an aggregated interim assessment, how that plays into accountability. There is just a lot of change on that front. And then on the school choice measures, really interesting, right? Because in a lot of states, it's growing, it's changing, it's increasing. The federal level, we talk about school choice, but in these three instances, those measures failed. And Tom, I know you've done a little bit of digging into why this is kind of a unique situation here.
Yeah, what I looked into, Doug, and I'll just categorize this as that it appears to me, and there may be evidence from that goes way, way back. But if you look at the past and look at any time that a ballot measure has gone to the voters, whether it's to repeal a piece of legislation that the legislature has passed that expanded school choice, or whether it was a proposition to expand school choice or funding going to it, that whenever it gets to the ballot, they lose when people get to vote on it. They can get through the legislature and can even seem to poll very strongly when they're going through the legislature. But if there's an effort to repeal them, or if there's an effort to put this on the ballot and it's successful, by the time you get to voting and the different messaging that is tied to either the pro school choice side or the anti-school choice side, voters, as far as I have been able to find, have always voted against expanding school choice. And I think that's, well, you can draw your own conclusions from that, but it's not an anomaly what happened here with these three. It's a trend that's been going on for some time.
All right, we're going to keep moving. That's you know, a lot of sort of where things settled, what won, what lost, who won and who lost. I thought this was pretty interesting slide. It's from Ed Next. And you know, obviously there's some partisan divides on education. We all, I think, probably have a sense of those, school choice being one that we often see, but there are many others. I just thought this was particularly fascinating, the differences between the parties, and I tried to highlight a few of these. Offering a free education to every child. There's some real differences between the parties. Offering meals and other supports to children from low-income families. Helping children to find happiness and fulfillment. Creating a strong community. You can see these. The one that is the greatest is teaching children the importance of embracing differences. Right, and this traces back to some of the anti-woke, some of the, you know, debates around these cultural issues. I just some of the divide runs deeper than I think we may realize, but there's also some real shared beliefs in education as well. So I thought this was fascinating. I honestly have a little bit of trouble drawing conclusions other than you kind of know it when you see it, and this will play out, right, with red states, you know, with the newly elected governor, or, you know, trifecta majorities for Republicans or Democrats. Their area of emphasis beyond some of the big ticket items will play out in many ways. And this was just one slide that I thought kind of brought home some of those differences that go beyond the sort of headline. So just wanted to share that. Tom, Tara, anything to add before I keep moving on?
No.
Okay, so we're going to cover these last few slides relatively quickly. I love this quote. I'm a hockey guy. This is Wayne Gretzky, and he's talking about, well, you got to skate to where the puck is going. So where is the puck going? We've talked about some of that with the elections, but there's also some trends, some issues to watch. I'm not going to read through all of these different sort of, um, uh, I guess, things, and I hate to use the word things, but all of these have an impact on where education is going. We talked a lot about politics, policy, funding, the shifting consensus, the leadership. All of this makes sense, right? But they all play into, you know, what both we see, you know, kind of as the overarching policy and funding choices, but also just how people are looking at educating children and the choices that they're making on a day-to-day basis with funding they already have. So I think these all play a role in where things are headed, and in different ways. And some of them are counterbalancing each other. Some of them are all kind of reinforcing. Happy to talk through this more later, but all things to just keep an eye on as you think about the year and years ahead. Clearly, post-pandemic, we've had a shifting consensus. Obviously, ESSER funds are gone, but there are longer term implications, right? We talked a little bit about assessment and accountability. I think the era of us, you know, having a textbook, which we kind of knew, but having one set curriculum, I think is shifting, right, to competency-based approaches, personalized learning, project-based learning. I put CCR here as less emphasized because that term of college and career readiness, I really see that giving way to workforce readiness or career pathways. Clearly, safety is of paramount and is only going to increase in emphasis. School choice, engaging students, the fact that we have a chronic absenteeism issue, the student mental health continues to be a focus, although I'll say it still remains in my mind a bit undefined of exactly what we mean by that and how we address it. And then this notion of evidence-based, the science of reading, the science of math is coming. And so you can just see sort of post-pandemic, there were some shifts there as well. Tom, Tara, anything before I move on?
No,
Nope.
I'm good. Excited for you to show the next slide.
Yeah. Same here.
So, non-scientific survey. This was, us as a Strategos group. We got a few other folks to join in and sort of, you know, indicate what they think are the most important issues going forward. And this is 20, I believe it's like 20 plus issues. And so there's a lot here. But some of this aligns, right, with what we've been talking about, what we've been seeing. School safety. Obviously, the end of ESSER is going to have an impact, and I'll talk about funding in a minute. I'll just pause here, Tara, Tom. You all may have things to say, but this was sort of our, again, non-scientific way of starting to like layer in which of these issues do we think are going to get the most attention, are being talked about the most.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I was surprised. Suppose I shouldn't be, but I was surprised to see school safety still really up there at the top. I think obviously here and many other states, it's been topic of conversation. I once heard a member say we should have a school safety bill every single year. There's always room for improvement. And so I was surprised to see this first, but I don't see it changing, I suppose.
Yeah, and I would just say, Doug, that I was pleased to see some of these where they ended up, because I think some of these that didn't score as high, they seem to kind of suck all the oxygen out of the room when we do start discussing them. But when you look at what really is, the priorities, then I think those align with what we see people who are actually working to improve education for students are focusing on. I was happy, when you see AI in the top 5 there, I think that is will only continue to increase. I was happy to see the science of math, getting more and more attention. I think it's a positive because of the areas here are focusing on those things that will improve education opportunities for kids and their lives after high school.
I think it's also a reminder that everything there's so much that ended up scoring, between 7 and 10. And like that was really incredible to me to see how many things there are just so many issues to tackle, right? And I think that's obviously
Yep.
emblematic of how this stuff scored.
No, 100% agree. I won't spend any time on this. If you look at the top 10, this is my sort of view alone. Like if you take that huge list and you start to break it down and reorganize it a little bit, I think these are all going to be issues driving policy, driving conversation, purchasing decisions. But let's hone in on funding for a few minutes here. Again, I will say the end of ESSER clearly having an impact, will have an impact. But there's an old saying in local news, right? If it bleeds, it leads. And so the stories about oh my God, the world is ending because ESSER's done. Frankly, I find them a little overblown. We still spend $800 billion a year, non-stimulus, regular funding at the federal, state, and local level. The federal percent, it depends on the state and the district, averages out to about 10% or about 80 billion. And then state and local, the percent that each makes of that, again, depends on the state, local tax base, policy. But you can see here too, right? Like they're still spending a lot per kid. And I know cost of living, inflation, it's eating into these numbers. But even in quote low spending states, those are pretty healthy numbers per kid in each of these states. And then the chart on the other side with the lines kind of going up. In real dollar terms, there's only a couple of states that are really either flat or down. And you can see Louisiana, West Virginia. But as a trend from 2012 to 2022, or 2020 in this case, there is more money in the system than there was 8 years ago or 10 years ago. So I view this not as dire as the Great Recession that we came out of, back in 2008-ish. Certainly, it's a tougher fiscal environment, but it's more back to normal than it is. We all fell off a cliff and are dying a fiscal death. Whoops, and I just lost my slides, so let me pull those back. I hit the wrong button here. I meant to hit this button. And then, one last thing that I'll just point out on funding. That's all well and good, right? And education is typically the top one or two funding items in a state budget. But how are economies holding up? I think nationally, we're doing pretty good, all things considered. I think we came in for the soft landing that folks thought would be really difficult to do. It feels like we're there. And certainly there are some states that are in more difficult financial situations than others. But if you look at state GDP as a measure of their gross domestic product in real terms, the only state that was down in Q2 of this year was Alaska. Now, you see a lot of flat, right? A lot of kind of status quo, but there's a handful of states that are up. I mean, heck, even California with all their budget issues. So, as an indicator of financial health, it's helpful to understand what is the direction of spending, and then how does this translate into the revenue that's coming into a state and the expenditures that they may want to put forward. It's all related, right? They talk about the animal spirits on Wall Street, like the attitude toward, are we doing okay? Do we feel like revenues are coming in so we're more comfortable with spending? It all ties together. And I think for me, the net here is we're doing okay. It's not terrible, and there will be instances where it's tougher. And in some states, it's going to be more challenging. But on the whole, in many states, we're in a decent position. Not necessarily huge increases. There's not a lot of new money, but the existing expenditures, which is significant, still seems to be there. So let me just say, Tom, Tara, any thoughts on this as we look forward to, next year and the fiscal situation?
Yeah, let me just add an interesting twist to this. I think is that energy policy is going to change with the new administration. Any state that is energy rich, I think is going to benefit from that. You look at North Dakota, that has one of the smallest increases. That's going to change, right? Because there are opportunities to the income that they'll be able to create under the what will definitely be in new energy policies. Wyoming will benefit from that. So that's just an interesting side note on how that policy change can have a huge impact on some states' GDP.
That's a really interesting observation, Tom.
It is.
So, Doug, one of the questions in the chat, it's a great question. Do you think the administration's nomination of several high-profile tech leaders is a sign that it will be friendly to ed tech and specifically AI in education?
That is a really good question, and I think we don't know. I just can't predict it. I mean, Tara, Tom, I'd love your thoughts on this. Will they be friendly to AI? I mean, I don't even know what that means from the federal level. If it means less regulatory interference, I would say yes. If they mean like putting funding behind AI initiatives, honestly, I don't see that happening. But Tara, it sounds like you had a thought.
Well, I was going to say, I think, looking at nominations and looking at who an administration appoints is more reflective to me of who has been courting that administration. And so I think it's more a signal that ed tech and other tech leaders made a bet that Trump would be supportive. I think to your point, Doug, like they're probably not going to have many AI initiatives. I think we're going to get a lot from them around student data privacy. Like I think that will continue to be something that we hear about in a bipartisan fashion. But yeah, I think to me it's more, I don't have a direct answer, but it's always a reflection of like, okay, these ed tech leaders, technology leaders in general, they made a gamble and we'll see how it turns out for them.
Yeah, Doug, I think that what you will probably see is some changes to allowable uses for some funds that will be more open to, technology investments that districts or states want to make. And I think the regulatory, at least they'll look at it, there will be more looking at it through a lens of people that are far more comfortable with the advancement in technology as they look at current regulations and any new regulations that may come through the department.
I totally agree. And we're over time now, so want to thank everyone for joining us. Great discussion. We could talk on and on and on about this. Clearly, a lot is changing, but there's still some that's staying the same. Some of the same areas of emphasis that we've seen before will continue and only increase. But we're here for you. If you have further questions, if you want to dig in more, we all love to talk about this, and there's much more to unpack in the days and weeks and months ahead. So, Tom, Tara, thank you for joining me today. And we will keep you posted as we get more developments at the federal level and at the state level and see how this all plays out in 2025. Happy Thanksgiving to everyone, and we hope to see you again soon.
Well done, Doug. Thank you.